You think love is about texting more, chasing harder, showing them how safe and good you are for them, right? Wrong. If the person you're drawn to is an avoidant, the very things you're doing to get closer are the exact things pushing them away. But there's one move, one mindset shift that instantly shifts the dynamic and pulls them in. Deep. Let's get one thing straight. Avoidants don't hate connection. They crave it, but they fear losing themselves in it even more. So when you come in with overwhelming emotion, high expectations, or pressure to define the relationship, their defense mechanisms fire off. They disappear. They detach. They say things like, I just need space, or I'm not ready for anything serious. But here's the thing. The way you respond to their fear, not your love, your looks, or your loyalty, determines whether they pull away or fall in deep. And in this speech, I'm going to hand you the one counterintuitive behavior that turns fear into fascination and distance into desire. Stick around because I'm not here to play games. I'm here to teach you how to attract an avoidant from the inside out. When you're in any kind of relationship with an avoidantly attached person, the emotional temperature of the connection often feels unpredictable. One moment you feel close, like they've finally let their guard down. The next, they're distant, cold, aloof, retreating into silence, or worse, rationalizing their detachment with a sentence like, I just need time to think. For someone with a more secure or anxious attachment, this sudden shift triggers panic, the need to fix it, talk it out, pull them closer, or regain control sets in almost instantly. But what you have to understand is this. Your first, most powerful act of influence isn't in what you say. It's in your state. When your nervous system is dysregulated, when you're anxious, emotionally flooded, or driven by fear, you emit an energy that an avoidant can detect instantly. And it reinforces their deepest fear. That connection equals chaos, obligation, or emotional suffocation. If you want to create deep attraction for an avoidant, the first and most counterintuitive thing you must learn is how to stay internally grounded, no matter what they're doing. Your ability to regulate your own nervous system, especially when their behavior feels rejecting, sets the entire tone for the relationship. Why? Because avoidants aren't watching your words. They're watching your reaction. If you chase them, spiral into anxious messages, or confront them emotionally when they pull away, they don't interpret it as love. They interpret it as pressure. The more dysregulated you become, the more they retreat. But when you meet their avoidance with calm, not silence that punishes, but stillness that understands, you become something rare to them. You become the first person who doesn't punish them for needing space. And that disrupts their entire pattern. To regulate your nervous system, you have to first become aware of what your body does in moments of disconnection. Do your muscles tense? Does your chest tighten? Does your mind race to worst-case scenarios? Notice it. Don't judge it. And most importantly, don't react from it. Most people let that discomfort lead them straight into behaviors that sabotage connection. The late-night emotional text, the guilt-tripping message, the passive-aggressive comment. But attraction, especially for an avoidant, deepens when they feel that your world doesn't collapse the moment they step back, that your sense of safety is internally sourced, not dependent on their closeness. This doesn't mean pretending you don't care. It means creating a pause between your trigger and your response. It means you stop, breathe, reflect, and ground yourself before taking any action. Grounding doesn't require a yoga mat or a journal. It requires intention. The moment you feel the wave of panic hit when they go silent or seem emotionally off, ask yourself, what do I need to give myself right now that I'm unconsciously demanding from them? Do you need reassurance, safety, validation? Give it to yourself first. Remind yourself their pullback is not a referendum on your worth. It's a reflection of their fear. When you internalize that, you stop making their retreat personal, and that's when your power returns. Because when you're emotionally self-regulated, your decisions come from confidence, not desperation. And here's the deeper truth. Emotional steadiness is sexy to an avoidant. It signals maturity. It tells their nervous system, you're safe here. You can breathe here. There's no emotional chase waiting around the corner. The avoidant person isn't attracted to emotional neediness. They're attracted to emotional sovereignty. And emotional sovereignty isn't cold. It's warm, calm presence that doesn't hinge on their validation. It's the type of energy that allows you to say, I care about you, but I'm okay whether you're close or distant. That doesn't mean you allow disrespect or neglect. It means you've mastered the art of non-reactivity, and that alone disarms their fear more than any love confession ever will. Avoidants were likely wired in early life to associate closeness with unpredictability or engulfment. They've built an entire psychological defense system to protect themselves from that chaos. But when they encounter someone whose internal world is still, steady, and self-sufficient, something in them softens. Their guard doesn't go up. It starts to lower. Because that person isn't tugging, pressuring, or reacting. They're present. They're emotionally available, but not emotionally volatile. And that kind of presence is unforgettable. It creates a subtle, powerful pull that speaks directly to the avoidant's hidden longing, to be close without losing themselves. And that's what regulation really does. It creates a bridge. It takes you out of the role of the pursuer and into the role of the grounded mirror. You don't chase their fear. You hold space for it. You don't demand closeness. You model safety. And when you show them through your energy that you can handle their discomfort without crumbling or panicking, you become the exception. Not because you manipulated them, but because your emotional tone taught their nervous system something new. That intimacy doesn't have to be a threat. It can be quiet, steady, safe, desirable. When you're in love with or emotionally invested in someone with an avoidant attachment style, one of the hardest things to do is not take their need for distance personally. The moment they begin to pull away, whether it's through short, vague texts, canceling plans last minute, or withdrawing emotionally, it stirs up an almost primal panic. Your mind spins. Your stomach knots. You go from feeling secure to deeply confused, even rejected, and the immediate instinct is often to close the gap. You want to restore that feeling of connection, so you reach out more, you ask questions, you try to fix what feels broken. But what you have to understand is this. Avoidants don't interpret closeness the same way you do. For them, connection can feel like a threat to their independence. The more you try to close in, the more suffocated they feel. And when your attempts to reconnect come from anxiety, fear, or resentment, they don't see it as love, they experience it as pressure. And that pressure pushes them even further away. Respecting their distance without resentment is one of the most powerful things you can do, not just for the health of the relationship, but for your own emotional freedom. Avoidants aren't wired to process intimacy at the same speed as someone with a secure or anxious style. So when they hit their internal closeness threshold, they need to back up. Not because they don't care, not because they're playing games, but because that space is how they self-regulate. They feel safe when there's enough room to breathe, think, and emotionally recharge. Your job isn't to interpret that space as rejection. Your job is to hold it with grace, not with guilt. The key here is emotional posture. When they take space and you respond with maturity and steadiness, they start to associate closeness with something they rarely experience, respectful freedom. That's rare. That's magnetic. It's also important to know what respecting distance actually looks like. It doesn't mean disappearing in return. It doesn't mean suppressing your needs or pretending to be okay with behavior that truly crosses a line. What it means is this: you don't chase. You don't emotionally punish. You don't send veiled, guilt-laced messages. You don't try to force a conversation before they're ready to have one. You give them the space they're asking for without turning that into a dramatic event. You get quiet, not to manipulate, but to recenter. You focus on your life, your peace, your lane, because what builds attraction isn't just giving space. It's giving it with a kind of emotional elegance that says, I respect your rhythm, but I won't abandon myself waiting for you to return. Most people struggle here because their fear of abandonment gets triggered. They want to be told it's not personal. They want reassurance that the distance doesn't mean disinterest. But with avoidance, you're not always going to get that kind of clarity right away. And that's where you grow. That's where the relationship either matures or collapses under the weight of anxiety and unmet expectations. The real challenge is to stay connected to yourself when they disconnect from you. Because when you can hold your own emotional ground without spiraling, without projecting, without retaliating, they feel something that disrupts their old story. They realize that closeness doesn't have to cost them their freedom. That's how you become different in their eyes. You're not trying to trap them in intimacy. You're letting them move, breathe, and process. And you're doing it from a place of strength, not submission. Resentment shows up when you give space, but secretly hold a grudge. When you say, take your time, but then emotionally withdraw and protest. That passive punishment creates confusion, not safety, and it reinforces their belief that closeness always comes with hidden expectations. But when you can genuinely give space while keeping the door open without slamming it or guarding it, you change the narrative. You become the kind of partner they didn't believe existed, someone who can handle their autonomy without punishing them for it. That's the paradox. The more space you give without resentment, the more likely they are to return. And not just return, but return with trust. What most avoidants are subconsciously looking for isn't someone who matches their avoidance. It's someone who can regulate their own emotions without demanding emotional labor from them during withdrawal. Someone who understands that emotional independence doesn't mean emotional disconnection. Someone who sees their retreat not as a betrayal, but as a form of self-protection. And when you give them that grace, not because you're pretending to be chill, but because you genuinely understand, you become safe. And when they finally feel safe, attraction doesn't just surface, it deepens. One of the most deeply ingrained habits many people bring into relationships, especially when they care deeply, is the urge to fix things. Fix the silence. Fix the awkwardness. Fix the moment they seem sad, withdrawn, or triggered. Especially when you're dealing with an avoidantly attached partner, that instinct to jump in and soothe, solve, or reassure can feel like love in action. But to an avoidant, it can feel like emotional invasion. What you call support, they experience as pressure. What you think is helping, they interpret as a subtle message that who they are as they are in that moment is somehow not okay. And here's the reality most people overlook. Trying to fix an avoidance discomfort does not build closeness. It builds resistance. It doesn't create safety. It creates stress. Because the core of the avoidance emotional programming is this: I have to manage my feelings alone. Intimacy is risky. Dependence is dangerous. So when you rush in to fix, even with good intentions, you reinforce that narrative. You confirm that closeness equals control, that connection demands emotional labor, and that their internal world will always be monitored and managed by someone else. People who love avoidance often confuse empathy with rescue. You see them struggling. They withdraw emotionally. Maybe they've had a rough day or you sense something is wrong, and because you care, you lean in. You ask more questions. You offer solutions. You try to reassure them or bring them back into connection. But what you have to realize is this: avoidants don't trust easily. And part of that mistrust is rooted in the fear that vulnerability will be met with judgment, smothering, or unsolicited advice. When you try to fix their emotional state, it can feel to them like you're not actually present. You're performing. You're not witnessing their experience. You're bypassing it. And that bypass, even when masked as love, feels like intrusion. It denies them the space to be with their own feelings, in their own way, on their own terms. To stop fixing their discomfort, you have to build a new emotional muscle: restraint, the ability to be with someone's discomfort without making it your responsibility to change it. That means allowing them to sit in their own silence without interpreting it as a crisis. That means resisting the urge to over-explain, over-offer, or over-accommodate just to make things feel better. It means holding emotional space without trying to manage their internal weather. Because when they feel that you can handle their distance, their mood swings, their shutdowns, without spiraling into anxiety or launching into "how do I help" mode, they begin to feel something they don't often feel in relationships: trusted. And trust is what makes attraction deepen for avoidance. Not caretaking, not overfunctioning, not control disguised as compassion. What makes them feel safe is your non-reactivity. Your ability to stay calm, grounded, and supportive without becoming invasive, needy, or overly nurturing. There's a deep emotional difference between "I'm here if you want to talk" and "tell me what's wrong so I can make it better." The former communicates safety, patience, and presence. The latter communicates a subtle but real discomfort with their emotional independence. If you need them to open up for you to feel secure, you're no longer being present. You're using their vulnerability to soothe your anxiety. And that dynamic is exactly what repels avoidance, no matter how sweet or loving the delivery sounds. They start to feel like your emotional peace depends on their emotional availability. And that is the very thing they fear: enmeshment. That they won't be loved for who they are, but for how well they perform emotional openness on demand. What builds a real bond with an avoidant isn't constantly offering help. It's letting them know they don't have to be fixed, that they don't need to explain every emotional low to be worthy of your presence, that they can sit in discomfort and still be accepted, still be loved, still be respected, that you're not there to save them from their feelings, but to sit beside them in quiet understanding. This shift is powerful. It makes you feel less like a manager and more like a partner, and it helps them begin to internalize the idea that closeness doesn't always come with conditions or expectations, that someone can love them even in moments when they have absolutely nothing to give. Letting go of the impulse to fix doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means developing a more secure, grounded version of love. One where you don't panic when someone isn't immediately open. One where you can feel discomfort in the room and not make it your mission to eliminate it. One where you can trust that your presence without pressure is more healing than any perfectly crafted sentence or solution ever could be. Because what avoidants are actually drawn to, what they are quietly starving for, is connection without captivity. And when you stop trying to fix them, they finally get to experience what that really feels like. One of the most common mistakes people make when they fall for an avoidant partner is pausing their own life in hopes that the other person will come around. They slow down their own momentum. They tiptoe around their dreams. They shrink their energy. They dim their light, hoping that by making themselves less overwhelming, more available, more flexible, the avoidant will feel safe enough to choose them fully. But here's what actually happens. That pause, no matter how subtle, creates the very energy that pushes the avoidant further away. Not because you're not lovable, not because you're not worthy, but because deep down, avoidants don't feel drawn to someone whose center of gravity becomes them. They may crave connection, but they're terrified of being the reason you stop living your life. And whether they say it out loud or not, they feel the shift the moment your world starts orbiting around theirs. The moment your joy becomes dependent on their texts. The moment your plans become wait lists, quietly hoping for their availability. That kind of energy doesn't feel like freedom to an avoidant. It feels like pressure, and pressure makes them pull away. What creates deep attraction for an avoidant, what disarms their defenses in the most unexpected way, is being in the presence of someone who is fully, unapologetically alive. Someone whose days are full of things that light them up. Someone who doesn't put their passion, purpose, or personal power on hold for anyone. This kind of energy is contagious. It's grounding. It communicates something avoidants rarely get to experience. You're welcome in my world, but I'm not going to stop spinning if you disappear. That message is potent. It disrupts the familiar script in their head that says relationships will rob them of space, selfhood, and independence. Instead, they meet someone who isn't chasing them, isn't begging for closeness, isn't waiting for emotional breadcrumbs. And that emotional nonchalance, it's not about being cold. It's about being whole. And wholeness is magnetic. There's a level of inner confidence that comes with living your life fully. When you stop editing your choices to avoid triggering their fear of closeness, and instead return to the rhythm of your own life. The workout class you skipped because you wanted to be free just in case they called. The trip you postponed because they were being distant and you didn't want to be unavailable if they came back around. The boundaries you bent, the invitations you declined, the parts of yourself you slowly disconnected from in the name of making room for them. All of that, every bit of it, sends a silent message to an avoidant. My life revolves around you. And while some part of you might think that will make them stay, it's usually the moment they start to feel trapped, because they sense the shift, even if you never say it. They feel the unspoken pressure of your waiting, your hoping, your emotional investment outweighing theirs. And that's when they run. Not because they don't care, but because it feels like too much. Not too much love, but too much weight. So what does it actually look like to live fully and boldly without waiting? It looks like making plans you're excited about and sticking to them, regardless of whether they've texted you back. It looks like building a life so rich, so rooted, so meaningful that their presence becomes a bonus, not your oxygen. It looks like putting your energy into your friendships, your goals, your growth, rather than constantly scanning for signs that they're finally ready. It means being the kind of person who walks through the world with momentum. Someone who doesn't just talk about living fully, but embodies it in how they speak, move, create, and connect. That kind of self-responsibility isn't just attractive, it's healing. It creates a space where an avoidant can lean in without fear because they know you're not going to collapse into them. You're not going to hand them the keys to your identity and ask them to drive. The irony is, the more you anchor into your own life, the more likely they are to want to be part of it. Not because you convinced them, not because you made yourself smaller to accommodate their fear, but because your energy becomes undeniable. You stop being a source of emotional pressure and start becoming a source of inspiration. And that shift changes everything. You go from being someone who needs them to feel whole to someone who already is whole. And for an avoidant, that's rare. That's disarming. That's the kind of energy they gravitate toward, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of genuine interest. Because deep down, avoidants want to be close. They just want to know that getting close won't cost them everything. When you live your life boldly, freely, and without hesitation, you become living proof that love doesn't have to come with sacrifice, stagnation, or the death of self. You become the person who reminds them that they can have connection and freedom, intimacy, and individuality. You become the exception, not by chasing them, but by chasing your own life with so much passion that they can't help but want to be near it. One of the most confusing dynamics you'll experience with an avoidant partner is the way they oscillate between closeness and distance. One moment they're affectionate, present, maybe even deeply connected, and the next they seem cold, distracted, or emotionally detached. For someone who thrives on consistency, clarity, or emotional expression, this shift can feel like a storm you never saw coming. The reflexive response is to move faster, send more messages, ask more questions, try to pull them back into connection. But if there's one thing you need to understand, it's this. Avoidants don't respond well to pursuit. What they actually respond to, what builds trust, comfort, and eventually desire, is attunement. Not emotional chasing, not performing closeness, but quietly and confidently mirroring their pace. Not in a passive, people-pleasing way, but in a grounded, self-anchored way that says, I see you, I feel your energy shift, and I respect it, but I won't lose myself to match it. Mirroring their pace is not about mimicking their emotional unavailability. It's not about playing games or pretending you don't care. It's about becoming deeply present to the rhythm of the connection and learning how to respond without abandoning your own emotional integrity. When they slow down, you slow down, not to punish, but to honor. Not because you're afraid of rejection, but because you trust yourself enough to know that matching their emotional tempo doesn't mean betraying your own. It's the art of stillness, of confidence, of pausing instead of pursuing. It's the powerful message that says, I'm here, but I'm not chasing. I care, but I don't cling. I want you, but I want myself more. Avoidants often feel most comfortable when the emotional environment around them feels neutral, steady, and low pressure. The second they feel someone is moving too quickly, emotionally, physically, or energetically, they start pulling back. That doesn't always mean they don't feel something for you. It usually means they're overwhelmed by the intensity. When you mirror their pace without resentment or fear, you create a sense of safety. They realize that being close to you doesn't require them to perform, explain, or constantly be on. You're not chasing, but you're not rejecting either. You're just calmly holding space, moving with them, not ahead of them, and most importantly, not trying to pull them behind you. That subtle attunement creates a ripple effect. It tells their nervous system, this is a person who respects timing, autonomy, and emotion without demand. That's rare, and rare for an avoidant is unforgettable. But let's be honest, this takes emotional discipline because the anxious part of you may want to lean in when they lean out. The insecure part may want to ask, is everything okay, when they go quiet? The overfunctioning part may feel tempted to close the emotional gap before it gets too wide. And while all of those impulses are natural, they are usually rooted in your discomfort, not theirs. When you slow yourself down and mirror instead of chase, you disrupt your own reactive pattern first. You reclaim your center. You stop seeing their distance as a personal failure and start seeing it as an invitation to return to yourself. That pause, that conscious slowdown, that decision to not rush into closeness is where your power lives. Mirroring also means learning how to emotionally regulate without using them as your anchor. If their silence makes you spiral, that's not your cue to overcommunicate. That's your cue to ground yourself. If their withdrawal makes you feel panicked, that's not a signal that you've done something wrong. It's a signal that you need to come back into alignment with your own needs, values, and boundaries. Because here's the truth. If you rush closeness just to soothe your fear of abandonment, you're not really building connection. You're building codependency. Mirroring their pace, on the other hand, is a way of building a relationship that breathes, a relationship that doesn't collapse under pressure, a connection that evolves with space, not in spite of it. This isn't about lowering your standards or tolerating inconsistency. It's about choosing responsiveness over reactivity. When they slow down, you don't panic, you pivot. You don't chase, you check in with yourself. You don't pull them closer, you hold your own position because you know who you are, what you want, and what you're worth. And that internal clarity allows you to mirror without manipulation, to walk beside someone, not behind them, to move at a speed that honors both their fear and your self-respect. This is what it means to be secure with someone who isn't. Not by fixing them, not by overpowering them with affection, but by becoming such a steady presence that they realize for the first time that connection doesn't have to cost them freedom, and being loved doesn't have to mean being chased, cornered, or overwhelmed. It can mean being seen, respected, and met right where they are, at a pace that feels safe. Emotional safety is the cornerstone of any deep, lasting connection. But when you're dealing with an avoidant partner, how you communicate that safety is everything. Avoidants aren't pulled in by declarations of loyalty, dramatic demonstrations of love, or overt emotional reassurances. In fact, those kinds of gestures often backfire. They're not comforting to an avoidance nervous system. They're overwhelming. Because avoidants aren't just cautious of closeness. They're hyper alert to emotional expectations they might not be ready to meet. So when someone tries to prove they're safe with loud emotional intensity, oversharing, constant check-ins, or seeking constant affirmation, it doesn't land as safety. It lands as pressure, and pressure triggers their instinct to withdraw. If you want to build attraction and trust with someone who has avoidant tendencies, you have to learn this truth. Emotional safety for them must be felt, not forced. It must be woven into the small, consistent, quiet ways you show up, not shouted through dramatic reassurance or emotional intensity. Subtle emotional safety starts with presence. It's not what you say, it's how you exist in the space between moments. It's the pause before reacting. It's the way you can sit with their silence without needing to fill it. It's how you can be near them without needing to be needed every second. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to emotional cues, even if they pretend not to be. They're scanning your tone, your energy, your facial expressions. They notice the tension in your voice when you ask, "Is something wrong?" They pick up on the shift in your energy when they say they need space. They feel when your words say, "I'm fine," but your body is clearly signaling frustration or fear. And what they're searching for, whether they realize it or not, is incongruence. They want to know if you're actually okay with their boundaries or if you're just saying that to get closer. When they sense emotional mismatch, they retreat because it feels unsafe. Subtle safety, on the other hand, is congruent. What you say, what you do, and what you energetically communicate match. That's what makes it trustworthy. Creating that sense of trust doesn't mean minimizing your own needs or pretending to be fine when you're not. It means practicing emotional honesty in a way that doesn't demand or overwhelm. It's the difference between saying, "You never open up to me and I don't know where we stand," versus saying, "I care about you and I'm here when you're ready to talk." One is loud, emotionally loaded, and confrontational. It demands closeness. The other is steady, soft, and leaves room. It invites closeness. Avoidants don't feel safe when you try to extract emotions from them. They feel safe when you leave the door open and trust them enough to walk through it on their own. And they're far more likely to do so when they sense that you won't meet their vulnerability with emotional urgency. Subtle emotional safety is also about self-regulation. When they pull away or show discomfort and you stay grounded instead of panicked, that creates a ripple effect. It tells them that you're emotionally independent, that you can handle your own feelings and theirs without spiraling. It's not about being detached. It's about being solid. And that solidness makes them feel that they can be near you without being swallowed. They begin to associate your presence with peace, not pressure. They start to let their guard down, not because you pushed, but because you didn't react when they needed space, because you didn't personalize their silence, because you didn't emotionally implode when they couldn't meet you at the depth you were craving. That restraint, that inner strength, that's the quiet language of safety. One of the most powerful things you can offer an avoidant is emotional availability that doesn't seek to control. It's not about being cold, distant, or pretending not to care. It's about becoming a grounded presence that allows emotions to surface naturally. That looks like being okay with silence during conversations. It looks like not filling every gap with words or over-explaining your feelings just to get a response. It looks like knowing when to listen instead of fix. It's trusting that their discomfort is not your emergency. It's knowing that just because they're not emotionally expressive doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. And instead of trying to prove how emotionally safe you are, you show it in the way you move, in the way you don't rush, in the way you allow space for their emotions without pulling for reciprocity. Loud emotionality often stems from anxiety. It says, "Please show me you care." It says, "I'm scared you'll disappear if I don't say this now." But that anxiety, no matter how valid, does not create the kind of safety an avoidant responds to. They're not drawn to noise. They're drawn to neutrality, to groundedness, to someone who can be a calm in the storm, not another storm to weather, Your ability to hold space without pressuring them to fill it becomes the most disarming form of intimacy they've ever known. It's subtle, it's soft, and it doesn't just build trust. It rewires what trust feels like. Not loud, not overwhelming, not conditional, but safe, slow, and steady. Look, this isn't about pretending to be something you're not. It's about embodying a kind of emotional strength that naturally draws avoidants in because it doesn't threaten their autonomy. You're not begging for love. You're being the kind of presence that makes them want to offer it. Do this and watch them stop running. Not because you trapped them, but because for the first time they feel safe enough to stay.